In the spring of 2021, a wildlife biologist working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife was reviewing trail camera footage from a monitoring station in the Cascade foothills east of Seattle when she noticed something that stopped her mid-scroll. A bald eagle, full adult with the white head and tail that indicate a bird at least 5 years old, had landed on the carcass of a white-tailed deer. That alone was not remarkable. Eagles are opportunistic scavengers, and carrion feeding is documented behavior across the species. What was remarkable was what happened over the next 4 hours of footage. 17 additional bald eagles arrived at the same carcass. By the end of the recording window, the deer was gone, consumed entirely, and the camera had captured something that the biologist, in nearly 2 decades of fieldwork, had never personally witnessed at that scale. A congregation of bald eagles so dense it had functioned like a pack, cycling through the resource with a coordinated efficiency that bore no resemblance to the lone hunter perched on a snag above a river that had anchored the American cultural imagination of this animal for 200 years. She filed the observation in her monitoring database and moved on. There were other cameras, other data sets, other species to track. The footage sat in an archive. It was not publicized. It was not anomalous enough to generate a report. It was, by the standards of current bald eagle ecology in the Pacific Northwest, an ordinary afternoon. If you find yourself surprised by that last sentence, you are not alone, and the gap between what most people believe about bald eagle population status and what is actually happening on the ground across large portions of North America is the subject of this video. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because what we're getting into here is one of those stories where the conservation success that everyone celebrated has produced a second chapter that almost no one anticipated. And the second chapter is more complicated, more ecologically significant, and more consequential for a wider range of species and systems than the first chapter ever was. The first chapter is the one most people know. The bald eagle, selected as the national symbol of the United States in 1782, came within a meaningful distance of extinction in the lower 48 states during the middle of the 20th century. The collapse was precipitated primarily by the widespread use of dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, the pesticide known as DDT, which was applied across American agricultural landscapes in enormous quantities following World War II, and which moved through food chains in a process called biomagnification, concentrating at each trophic level until it reached the apex predators that accumulated it in quantities sufficient to cause reproductive failure. In bald eagles, DDT metabolized into a compound that interfered with calcium deposition in eggshells, producing eggs so thin they collapsed under the weight of the incubating parent. Nests produced no young. Populations aged without replacement. By 1963, the breeding population of bald eagles in the contiguous United States had fallen to 417 known nesting pairs. A species that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the time of European contact had been reduced, in the span of roughly 3 decades of intensive agricultural chemical use, to a remnant population barely large enough to sustain itself. The intervention that followed is one of the most celebrated stories in the history of American conservation. DDT was banned in the United States in 1972, following a regulatory process that is inseparable from the work of Rachel Carson, whose 1962 book, Silent Spring, documented the ecological consequences of pesticide use with a clarity and a moral seriousness that changed the terms of the public conversation about the relationship between industrial chemistry and the living world. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 provided legal protection for the bald eagle and the authority to designate and protect critical habitat. Active recovery programs were implemented in multiple states. Hacking programs, in which captive-bred eaglets were placed on platforms in areas of historic habitat and allowed to fledge into wild conditions, supplemented natural reproduction during the recovery's early decades. The results were unambiguous and dramatic. By 1995, the bald eagle had been downlisted from endangered to threatened under the Endangered Species Act. By 2007, it was fully delisted. The population in the lower 48 states had recovered to the point where the regulatory apparatus designed for a species in crisis was no longer warranted. The numbers that supported delisting were compelling by any measure. From 417 nesting pairs in 1963, the breeding population had grown to roughly 9,789 pairs by 2006, the year before the delisting decision was finalized. That is an increase of more than 2,000% in 4 decades. It is the kind of recovery trajectory that wildlife managers use as a benchmark against which other recovery efforts are measured. It is, by the most reasonable and fair assessment of the evidence, an extraordinary achievement. The people who fought for it, the scientists who documented the population collapse, the advocates who pushed for the DDT ban, the wildlife managers who implemented the recovery programs, deserve the credit they have received and more. What those numbers did not tell you in 2007, and what the delisting decision did not require anyone to think carefully about, was what comes next. The delisting of a species under the Endangered Species Act is predicated on the demonstration that the species is no longer at risk of extinction or significant decline. It is not predicated on an analysis of what the species will do to the ecosystems it occupies as its population continues to grow past the recovery threshold, through the recovery threshold, and into territory that the ecosystems those species inhabit have not encountered in living memory. The ESA framework is a framework for preventing loss. It is not a framework for managing abundance, and the bald eagle, in the nearly 2 decades since delisting, has demonstrated with increasing clarity what happens when a large, long-lived, highly efficient apex predator, with a flexible diet and a strong site fidelity, returns to abundance in ecosystems that reorganized themselves in its absence. By 2019, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service estimated the bald eagle population in the lower 48 states at approximately 316,700 individual birds. That number requires a moment of consideration. In 1963, there were 417 breeding pairs, meaning roughly 834 adult birds, and an unknown but presumably limited number of subadults and juveniles. In 2019, there were more than 316,000 individual birds. The population had not simply recovered. It had, by any reasonable reading of the term, exploded. And in specific regions of the country, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes states, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and Alaska, where the historical strongholds of the species were concentrated and where the recovery was most complete, the eagle's ecological footprint has begun to produce effects that the conservation movement that saved the species was not structured to anticipate. The first and most immediately visible of these effects is on fish populations, and specifically on the populations of anadromous salmonids, the Pacific salmon and steelhead species that constitute the ecological and cultural backbone of watershed systems, from northern California to southeast Alaska. Bald eagles have always eaten fish. Their association with rivers, lakes, and coastlines is not incidental. Fish are the prey type that the species evolved to exploit with the anatomical specializations of the osprey-like foot structure that allows them to grip wet, slippery targets, the positioning of the eyes, the dive geometry of their hunting technique. In systems where salmon are present, bald eagles have historically concentrated in large numbers during spawning runs, feeding on the spent carcasses of post-spawn adults and on live fish weakened by the physiological demands of the spawning process. John James Audubon documented congregations of eagles at salmon streams in the 19th century. Lewis and Clark observed them in numbers at Columbia River salmon fisheries in the early 1800s. The association is ancient and, in its historical context, was part of a functional ecological relationship in which eagle predation was one of many pressures on salmon populations that those populations had evolved to absorb. The context in 2024 is not the historical context. Pacific salmon populations across much of their range are at historic lows or in active decline, driven by a cascade of factors, including habitat degradation, altered hydrology from dams and water diversion, ocean condition changes associated with climate-driven shifts in marine productivity, and the cumulative effects of more than a century of overharvest. In river systems, where salmon runs have been reduced to a fraction of their historical abundance, the predation pressure from a recovering bald eagle population is not the trivial, easily absorbed ecological tax it represented when salmon were abundant. It is a meaningful, and in some cases, substantial, additional mortality source on populations that have no buffer capacity. The math of this is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable, because it places two conservation values in direct conflict in a way that the framework of the 1970s did not anticipate. Recovering the bald eagle was a conservation success. Recovering Pacific salmon is a conservation imperative, one that has cost billions of dollars in dam removal, habitat restoration, hatchery programs, and fisheries management over the past 4 decades. The bald eagle's recovery has produced a predator population that is now, in specific systems, consuming salmon in quantities that independent fisheries biologists have begun to flag as ecologically significant. The numbers are contested, as they always are when predator-prey relationships are being quantified in complex natural systems. But they are not being dismissed by the researchers who have looked most carefully at the data, and they are not going away as the eagle population continues to grow. The sockeye salmon runs of the Columbia River system have been the focus of some of the most detailed eagle predation research conducted in this context, and the findings from monitoring stations at key pinch points in the migration corridor, particularly at Bonneville Dam and the Cascades reach immediately upstream, have produced estimates of eagle predation on salmon smolts and adult migrants that have surprised researchers accustomed to thinking about eagles as a peripheral rather than a central factor in salmon survival. A 2016 study by researchers from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission found that bald eagles at Bonneville consumed an estimated 9 to 20% of the steelhead smolts passing through the area during peak migration periods. A 9 to 20% mortality hit on a population of already imperiled fish at a single point in a migration that involves dozens of additional mortality sources across hundreds of miles is not a number that fisheries managers can absorb into their models without adjusting their conclusions about the relative contribution of eagle predation to overall smolt mortality budgets. Similar dynamics have been documented at other choke points in the anadromous fish migration systems of the Pacific Northwest. At the fish ladders and passage structures at major dams on the Snake River system, bald eagle concentrations during spring smolt-out migration have grown substantially over the past 15 years as the regional eagle population has expanded. Birds from multiple states and from Canadian wintering populations have been documented converging on these locations, where the infrastructure of salmon passage concentrates fish in ways that make them unusually accessible to aerial predators. The dams themselves, whatever their other ecological costs, have inadvertently created eagle-feeding platforms of extraordinary productivity, and the eagles have learned this. Individual birds have been tracked returning to the same dam structures year after year, arriving on the same spring timetable that corresponds to smolt-out migration, and departing when the run is over. The behavioral flexibility and learning capacity that make the bald eagle such an effective predator are expressed here in a way that links the species' ecological impact directly to the infrastructure decisions humans have made in these river systems. The conflict between eagle recovery and salmon recovery has not been framed publicly as a conflict, and that framing gap is itself significant. Wildlife agencies responsible for managing eagle populations and fisheries agencies responsible for managing salmon recovery are operating under different statutory mandates, different funding streams, and different constituencies. The political and cultural weight of the bald eagle as a national symbol means that any discussion of managing eagle populations to reduce predation pressure on salmon runs immediately enters a space charged with symbolism that is largely disconnected from ecology. Suggesting that eagles need to be managed rather than simply celebrated is, in the current communications environment, the kind of statement that generates backlash disproportionate to its ecological content. The agencies know this. The researchers know this. And so the conversation that needs to happen is happening in technical literature and internal management discussions, rather than in the public forum, where the values trade-offs it implies would benefit from democratic deliberation. The salmon conflict is the most quantitatively documented of the ecological effects produced by the eagle population expansion. But it is not the only one, and in some respects, it is not the most ecologically novel. The effects on nesting waterbirds are in some ways more surprising and more difficult to manage because they involve a predator-prey dynamic that has changed in ways that are harder to model and that involve a wider range of species with a wider range of conservation statuses. Bald eagles prey on colonial nesting waterbirds with an efficiency that has increased in direct proportion to the eagle's recovery. Herons, egrets, cormorants, gulls, terns, and a range of duck and wading bird species that nest in colonial aggregations are vulnerable to eagle predation in ways that are ecologically distinct from what happens when an eagle takes a single fish from a river. Colonial nesting birds aggregate their reproductive effort in space, which is an anti-predator strategy that works when predator pressure is below a threshold that can be overwhelmed by collective vigilance and mobbing behavior. When predator pressure crosses that threshold, colonially nesting birds abandon sites entirely. The abandonment of a colonial nesting site in response to elevated eagle disturbance is not simply the loss of some eggs and chicks to predation. It is the loss of an entire reproductive season for a colony that may contain hundreds or thousands of breeding pairs, and it may be followed by permanent site abandonment if the disturbance continues across multiple seasons. The documentation of this dynamic in the Great Lakes region is among the most detailed available anywhere in the United States, and provides a window into what happens when eagle densities reach the levels now common in historically productive eagle habitat. In the Les Chenaux Islands of northern Lake Huron, a region with some of the highest bald eagle densities in the contiguous United States, researchers monitoring colonial waterbird nesting between 2008 and 2018 documented the progressive contraction and abandonment of great blue heron colonies, double-crested cormorant colonies, and common tern nesting areas at a rate that correlated strongly with increases in local eagle density. The pattern was consistent across sites and years. As eagle numbers at a location increased past a threshold that varied somewhat by colony type and site geography, the colonially nesting birds stopped breeding there. Some moved to alternative sites. Many did not breed at all in the years following abandonment. The eagles, meanwhile, showed strong site fidelity and remained. The common tern situation in the Great Lakes deserves specific attention because it illustrates a second-order effect that is less visible than direct predation, but ecologically significant. Common terns in the Great Lakes are already under pressure from habitat loss, from competition with ring-billed gulls for nesting real estate, and from the effects of water level fluctuations driven by the hydrology of the lake system and by climate-influenced precipitation patterns. Their population in the region has been declining for decades. The addition of elevated eagle disturbance to a colony of terns that is already operating at reduced numbers and with restricted access to suitable nesting habitat, does not simply add another mortality source to the mix. It interacts with all the other pressures multiplicatively, pushing populations that might have stabilized under the weight of existing stressors into a declining trajectory from which recovery becomes progressively less likely. The tern is not being eaten into oblivion by bald eagles. It is being pushed past a tipping point by a combination of factors, of which eagle disturbance is one, and the removal of any single factor from that combination would improve the tern's prospects. Eagle recovery, which was a conservation goal pursued in the same period when tern conservation was also a stated goal, has inadvertently made one of those goals harder to achieve. The Colonial waterbird story is replicated, with local variation, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, the coastal marshes of the Pacific Northwest, and the interior wetlands of the upper Midwest. Researchers studying black-crowned night herons, great egrets, Caspian terns, and laughing gulls in these systems have documented the same basic pattern at varying scales and with varying degrees of statistical certainty. Eagles disturb colonies. Colonies abandon sites. Alternative sites are frequently inferior in productivity. Breeding success declines. The populations that are affected are not all in danger of collapse, but they are not recovering in the trajectories that their conservation plans projected in the period before eagle densities reached current levels, and the gap between projected and actual recovery is at least partly attributable to a predator whose own recovery was never incorporated into the planning models for the prey species. The waterfowl dimension of the eagle impact picture is the one that has generated the most direct management response, because it involves economic interests as well as ecological ones, and because the constituency affected, the duck hunting community, and the waterfowl conservation organizations that represent it, has both the resources and the political engagement to push for management attention. The connection between expanding eagle populations and reduced duck production in key breeding areas of the prairie pothole region and the Great Lakes is contested in its quantitative specifics, but is no longer seriously disputed in its directional reality. Eagles, in concentrations now common in these areas, take ducklings, disturb nesting hens, and prevent successful incubation in ways that have measurable effects on local breeding success metrics. Ducks Unlimited, the organization whose primary conservation mission is the protection and restoration of waterfowl habitat, and which spends hundreds of millions of dollars annually on wetland conservation, has begun to incorporate eagle predation into its population modeling in a way it did not need to do 15 years ago. The internal discussions within the waterfowl management community about how to communicate the eagle's role in current duck production shortfalls without generating the inevitable backlash that follows any critical statement about the national bird reflect exactly the communications bind that the eagle's symbolic status creates. The ecology is one thing, the politics of discussing the ecology is another, and the gap between them is producing a public discourse about waterfowl population trends that is systematically less honest than the private discussions among the biologists who study those trends. Beyond the effects on other bird species, the expanding eagle population is producing documented effects on terrestrial mammal populations in ways that, when first reported, struck many ecologists as counterintuitive. Bald eagles are not conventionally thought of as significant predators of terrestrial mammals. They are waterbirds. They eat fish. That is the cultural template, and it has enough biological reality behind it to have dominated the scientific characterization of the species' diet for most of the 20th century. The reality is more flexible. Bald eagles have always taken small to medium mammals, opportunistically, and the research literature from the peak of the species' historical abundance, such as it is, contains references to eagle predation on rabbits, squirrels, muskrats, and other small mammals at frequencies that were never trivial. What is new, or rather, what is newly documented and newly significant given current eagle densities, is the scale and the systematic nature of mammalian prey use by bald eagles in areas where eagle populations have reached saturation. In the prairie regions of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, which support large wintering eagle populations, drawing from both the expanding breeding populations of the lower 48 states and from the resident Canadian breeding population, researchers have documented bald eagles as significant mortality sources for snowshoe hares during winter periods when fish are unavailable under ice. The snowshoe hare population cycle, one of the most famous dynamics in population ecology and the driver of the linked population cycle in Canada lynx that has anchored textbook treatments of predator-prey dynamics for a century, has historically been understood as primarily regulated by the interaction between hares, their plant food resources, and their mammalian predators. The incorporation of a bird predator as a significant mortality source during specific seasonal windows is a relatively new element in that system, and it is an element whose magnitude is still being quantified. The hare cycle implications extend further than they might initially appear to. Snowshoe hare abundance is the keystone variable in a boreal food web that includes not just lynx, but great horned owls, northern goshawks, red foxes, coyotes, and a range of other predators whose breeding success and population trajectory are directly tied to hare availability. When eagle predation adds a mortality increment to hare populations during winter, it does not simply reduce hare numbers. It potentially amplifies the depth of the low phase of the hare cycle, extending the period of scarcity and deepening the knock-on effects for all the predators linked to hares through that food web. The magnitude of this effect is uncertain. The direction of it is not. The lake and reservoir systems of the upper Midwest and the northern tier of the United States have their own version of this story, and it involves a set of prey species relationships that are economically and recreationally significant in a way that generates a different kind of management attention than the ecological effects on wild predator-prey systems. Bald eagles in the Great Lakes region, the upper Mississippi River drainage, and the inland lake systems of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan have been documented targeting yellow perch, walleye, and lake trout at rates that vary with local fish availability, but that have become large enough, in systems with high eagle densities, to appear in fisheries monitoring data as a detectable mortality increment on targeted sportfish populations. The yellow perch situation in Green Bay and the Saginaw Bay is the most discussed example in the Great Lakes fisheries management community, and the one that has most directly forced a conversation about eagles and sportfish that agency public information practices have generally tried to avoid. Yellow perch in both systems have been in decline for 2 decades, driven by a complex of causes including habitat degradation, phosphorus loading, the ecological disruption caused by invasive species, particularly zebra and quagga mussels, and changes in lake thermal structure associated with documented water temperature increases in the lakes. Eagle predation is not the primary driver of perch decline in either system, but it is, according to researchers who have worked through the mortality accounting with telemetry-tagged fish and direct observation at key feeding locations, a contributing factor of a magnitude that is not negligible when you are trying to understand why perch recovery is slower than the improvement in other measured environmental variables would predict. The pushback against incorporating eagle predation into fisheries management discussions has come from multiple directions and has been consistent enough across time and across different regional systems that it reflects something structural rather than coincidental. Conservation organizations, whose primary identity is built around the protection of birds of prey, are institutionally resistant to framing that connects eagle abundance with negative ecological outcomes for any species. Their resistance is not cynical. It reflects a genuine and defensible concern that any public acknowledgement of eagles as an ecological problem in any context will be weaponized by people who oppose bird protection regulations generally, and who will use the acknowledgement to undermine the broader framework of protections that prevented the eagle's extinction in the first place. That concern is historically grounded. It is also producing a communications environment in which the ecological reality of eagle impacts on fish and wildlife communities cannot be discussed with the honesty that good management requires. The sport fishing community and the hunting community have their own interests in this discussion that are neither entirely aligned with the conservation organization's position nor with the academic ecologist's desire for clean, quantitative answers. The anglers who have watched eagle numbers increase at their favorite walleye lake over 20 years, and who have watched walleye populations decline over the same period, are making an association that is not unreasonable even if it is not fully supported by controlled research. The duck hunters who have seen their bag limits reduced and who are aware that eagle densities in their hunting areas have increased are making a similar association. These communities are not wrong to make these associations. They are potentially wrong about the magnitude of the eagle's contribution to what they are observing relative to other factors. They are potentially wrong about the management response that would address the problem. But the dismissal of their observations as statistically naive or politically motivated is not a productive response from wildlife agencies that depend on those communities for both the funding base of wildlife management through license fees and excise taxes and the political support without which wildlife agencies lose the budget fights that matter. The regulatory framework surrounding the bald eagle after delisting is worth understanding in detail because it defines the boundaries within which management responses can and cannot operate, and because those boundaries are significantly more constraining than most people who are not wildlife lawyers understand. Delisting from the Endangered Species Act in 2007 removed the eagle from ESA protections, but did not remove it from protection entirely. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act of 1940, which predates the ESA by more than 3 decades, and which was itself a response to earlier population declines, prohibits the take, possession, import, export, sale, purchase, or transport of bald eagles or any of their parts, eggs, or nests without a federal permit. The penalties for violation are substantial. Lethal management of bald eagles to protect fish or other wildlife resources is not available as a routine management tool in the way that lethal management of other predators, including other bird predators, can be authorized. This regulatory situation is not irrational from the perspective of the concerns it was designed to address. The 1940 Act was passed because bald eagle killing was widespread, publicly acceptable, and contributing to population decline. The ESA protections that followed were passed because the population had continued to decline despite the 1940 Act and required more comprehensive intervention. The protections worked. The population recovered. But the regulatory architecture of that recovery was built for a world in which the primary threat to the bald eagle was human killing, and it is not well adapted to a world in which the primary ecological concern is the reverse, the consequences of eagle abundance for other species. The legal tools available to wildlife managers dealing with eagle impacts on salmon, on colonial waterbirds, on fisheries, are limited to non-lethal deterrence, hazing at specific locations, egg oiling in specific contexts, and habitat management. These tools have their place. They are not equal to the management challenges that current eagle population levels are producing in the most affected systems. The permit system under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act does allow for the taking of eagles under specific circumstances, including to protect other interests. But the permitting process is cumbersome, the standards are high, and the political cost of pursuing permits for eagle take is substantial enough that it is almost never done in practice. The regulatory gap between what management sometimes requires and what is politically and legally achievable in the current framework is being felt most acutely by wildlife managers in the Pacific Northwest, who are simultaneously responsible for recovering salmon and for protecting eagles, and who have no good tool for resolving the conflict when it becomes acute at specific locations. The irony of the eagle's success is that it has produced a predator whose impact on ecosystems cannot be managed with the full toolkit that wildlife managers have available for other species, because the cultural and legal status of the eagle places it in a category by itself that reflects its symbolic role as much as its ecological one. Golden eagles, which are not national symbols and which are protected under the same federal statute, receive substantially less public attention when their predation on sage grouse, pronghorn fawns, or other species of conservation concern is raised in management discussions. The conversation about golden eagles and sage grouse, which has been substantive and ongoing in the Intermountain West for over a decade, has not produced the same resistance to frank ecological discussion that conversations about bald eagles reliably generate. The biology of both situations is similarly complex. The politics are not. The climate dimension of the eagle population trajectory is one that has received less attention than it deserves, partly because it is slower moving and harder to quantify than the direct predation effects, and partly because it involves changes in eagle distribution and seasonality that are still unfolding. Bald eagles in the northern portions of their range are migratory, moving south in fall ahead of ice-up on the lakes and rivers that provide their primary feeding access, and returning north in spring as ice recedes. The timing and extent of these migrations have historically been governed primarily by ice phenology, the seasonal calendar of freezing and thawing that determines when fish are accessible under open water conditions. As lake and river ice-out dates across the northern states and Canada have shifted earlier under documented climate warming trends, the migration timing of eagles that breed and winter in these areas has also shifted. Birds are returning to breeding areas earlier. They are departing wintering areas later. The period of overlap between large eagle concentrations and the most sensitive phases of their prey species' reproductive cycles is expanding at the margins. This is not a catastrophic change. It is a directional one, and its direction is toward increased pressure on prey species at the times when they are most vulnerable. Colonial waterbirds that begin nesting in early spring in systems where eagle density has historically been low during that period because birds had not yet returned from winter ranges are now encountering eagles in significant numbers before their eggs hatch. The buffer that migration timing had provided is being reduced. The ecological accounting of eagle impacts on colonial nesting birds that does not incorporate this phenological shift is underestimating the current and near-future magnitude of the effect. The question of what an appropriate population level for bald eagles actually is, ecologically rather than legally or politically, is one that almost no one in a position of institutional authority is willing to answer in public, and the reluctance to engage with it is itself an important fact about the current state of wildlife management in the United States. Carrying capacity for a predator species is not a fixed number. It depends on prey availability, habitat quality, competition from other predators, and a range of other factors that vary across space and time. The bald eagle population has grown past the point of recovery by any reasonable definition and is now regulated primarily by food availability and nesting site availability rather than by management intervention. In systems where eagle food resources are abundant and nesting sites are available, populations will continue to grow until they hit a biological ceiling rather than a managed one. Whether the biological ceiling that the eagle population is moving toward is compatible with the conservation goals the United States has for salmon, for colonial waterbirds, for waterfowl, and for the full range of species with which eagles share ecosystems, is a question that requires an honest answer derived from ecological analysis rather than from the political and symbolic weight of the species being considered. That honest answer is not available in official documents. It is available in peer-reviewed literature, in the internal discussions of fisheries agencies and waterfowl management organizations, and in the observations of wildlife professionals who have spent careers watching what happens in systems where eagle densities have reached the levels now documented in the most heavily occupied parts of the species range. The convergence of those sources toward a consistent concern is not ambiguous. The reluctance to translate that concern into public policy discussion is. There is a specific irony in the eagle's current ecological situation that is worth dwelling on because it illuminates something fundamental about the assumptions embedded in the conservation biology that produced the recovery. The eagle was saved because the conservation movement of the 1960s and 1970s understood that apex predators have irreplaceable ecological functions, that their loss cascades through food webs in ways that degrade the systems that all species, including humans, depend on. The wolf restoration literature, which developed roughly in parallel with the eagle recovery, and which has been more publicly contested but more scientifically elaborated, established the concept of trophic cascade as a central organizing principle of large predator conservation. Remove the apex predator, the system degrades. Restore the apex predator, the system recovers. The eagle's return to abundance should, by this logic, represent a restoration of ecological function rather than the creation of ecological problems. The complication is that trophic cascade theory, in its most straightforward form, was developed and validated in systems where the predator in question had been absent long enough for the system to reorganize substantially in its absence, and where the restoration of the predator produced effects that were net positive by most measures because the system it returned to was functioning suboptimally without it. The eagle's situation is more complex because the systems it has returned to have changed in ways that alter the ecological context of its predation. Salmon populations are not what they were when eagles were abundant in the 19th century. Colonial waterbird populations are not what they were. The prey community that the eagle evolved to exploit in its historical abundance has been substantially restructured by a century of human modification that preceded and in some ways caused the eagle's decline. The eagle's return to abundance is not a restoration of a prior ecological state. It is the introduction of historical predation pressure into a substantially altered ecological context, and the outcomes of that introduction are not necessarily what trophic cascade theory would predict from first principles. The tribal nations of the Pacific Northwest have been living with this complexity in a practical sense for longer than it has registered as an ecological research problem, and their perspective on the eagle's impact on salmon provides a context that the academic and agency discussions have been slow to incorporate. The Columbia River tribes, whose treaty fishing rights represent both a legal and a cultural claim on salmon that predates the United States, have been raising concerns about eagle predation at salmon-critical locations for more than a decade. These concerns have been articulated in tribal fisheries management documents, in testimony at fish and wildlife management forums, and in direct communication with federal and state agencies. The response has been slow, partly because of the regulatory constraints on eagle management, partly because the agencies responsible for responding have different institutional priorities, and partly because the symbolic weight of the eagle in the mainstream American conservation conversation makes the tribal perspective on eagle impacts difficult to amplify through the channels that normally generate management attention. The tribal perspective is grounded in a specific and intimate knowledge of salmon-eagle dynamics at specific sites over long time periods that is qualitatively different from, but not inconsistent with, the scientific data being generated by academic researchers. Tribal fish monitors who have watched specific spawning reaches for decades have documented changes in eagle behavior and eagle impact on salmon that, when placed alongside the biological survey data, produce a convergent picture of increasing predation pressure on populations that cannot easily absorb it. The tribal management goal of restoring salmon abundance to levels sufficient to support treaty fishing rights at meaningful economic and cultural scales requires a frank accounting of all the mortality factors affecting salmon populations, including the one produced by a species whose recovery most of the mainstream conservation movement celebrates unconditionally. The management tools that do exist and that have been deployed in specific contexts where eagle impacts have become acute enough to generate agency action are worth examining because they illustrate both what is possible within the current regulatory framework and how far short of adequate those possibilities fall. Hazing, the use of visual and auditory deterrents to move eagles away from specific locations where they are causing unacceptable impacts, has been used at fish passage facilities and at colonial waterbird nesting areas with some short-term success. The success is specifically short-term because eagles are highly sight-faithful, highly intelligent, and capable of habituating to hazing stimuli with a speed that makes sustained deterrence resource-intensive and eventually ineffective. An eagle that has learned that a specific dam bypass channel produces reliable fish during smolt outmigration will return to that channel through hazing pressure until the hazing cost exceeds what the managing agency is willing to sustain. Habitat modification, specifically the reduction of perching and roosting structure at locations where eagle concentration is causing impact, has been used at some colonial waterbird sites and has had local success in some cases. The approach has obvious limits in natural landscape contexts, where the perching infrastructure is not human-provided and cannot be removed without broader landscape modification. Egg oiling, which prevents hatching by coating eggs with mineral oil that blocks gas exchange through the shell, is authorized under federal permit for bald eagles in specific circumstances. It is used rarely and at small scale because it requires active nest access, which creates logistics challenges and risk of eagle abandonment of nest sites that may be more ecologically costly than the predation the management is trying to reduce. It is also politically contentious in a way that limits its use to situations where the need is clear and the alternative is worse. The gap between what is needed and what is available in the management toolkit is most visible in the salmon systems of the Pacific Northwest, where the stakes are highest, the conflicts are sharpest, and the political constraints on honest management discussion are also strongest. Wildlife managers who have spent careers working on both salmon recovery and eagle monitoring, and who see the interaction between the two with a clarity that comes from decades of field experience, are, in private conversation, significantly more candid about the magnitude of the problem and the inadequacy of the current management response than their public communications suggest. That gap between private candor and public communication is not unique to this situation. It is a feature of wildlife management communications generally, in contexts where ecological reality is difficult to translate into policy action without generating backlash from constituencies whose support the agencies need. But it is particularly acute here because the species at the center of the conflict carries the weight of national symbolism that makes honest ecological discussion politically costly in a way that discussions about wolves, mountain lions, or coyotes simply are not. What an honest assessment of the current situation requires is not a reversal of the conservation values that produce the eagle's recovery. The bald eagle's survival and flourishing is a genuine good. The ecological functions that a recovered apex predator provides are real. The recovery stands as a model of what is possible when conservation science, regulatory action, and public will align around a shared goal. None of that is in question. What is in question is whether the conservation framework that succeeded in bringing the eagle back is adequate to managing the consequences of that success across the full range of ecological systems that are now experiencing those consequences? The answer, based on the evidence accumulated in the nearly 2 decades since delisting, is that it is not. Not because the framework was badly designed. It was designed for the problem it solved. It is not designed for the problem that success has created. The problem that success has created is not simple. It is not a single conflict between eagles and salmon, or between eagles and terns, or between eagles and waterfowl. It is a complex, multi-system interaction between a recovering apex predator and the restructured, often impoverished ecological communities that constitute its current habitat. The eagle evolved in ecosystems where salmon was so abundant that the waste from spawning runs fertilized entire watersheds and supported not just eagles but bears, wolves, ravens, and a cascade of smaller scavengers and decomposers. It evolved in systems where colonial waterbirds existed in densities that its predation could not meaningfully reduce. The current ecosystems of the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes, and the Chesapeake are not those systems. They are substantially depleted versions that cannot absorb predation pressure at historical rates because the prey populations that historically provided that buffer no longer exist at historical densities. Managing the bald eagle in this context means managing it as a member of impoverished communities rather than as a species returning to rich ones. And that management task requires tools, frameworks, and conversations that the current regulatory and political environment makes genuinely difficult to pursue. It requires acknowledging, publicly and clearly, that the bald eagle's population size has consequences for other species that deserve to be weighed in management decisions alongside the eagle's own conservation interests. It requires developing regulatory flexibility that allows wildlife managers to address acute eagle impacts on imperiled prey species, without either dismantling the legal framework that protected the eagle during its recovery or accepting the false premise that a recovered species must be entirely exempt from management consideration regardless of its effects on other species. It requires, above all, an honest public conversation about what ecological recovery actually means for a species like the bald eagle, one that goes beyond the celebration of the recovery milestone to engage seriously with what a self-sustaining, abundant population of apex predators does to the systems it inhabits, and what management responsibilities accompany the genuine conservation success of bringing such a species back. The celebration was warranted. The conversation about what comes after the celebration has barely begun. It is past time to begin it, in the open, with the honesty that the ecological stakes require and that the species, whatever its symbolic weight, deserves as an organism whose relationship to the living world around it is more complicated and more consequential than any national symbol can fully represent. The eagle is back. That is a remarkable thing. What it means for the rivers, the lakes, the marshes, and the other species that share its world is a question whose answer is still being written in the field data that researchers are collecting right now, in systems across the continent where the consequences of the eagle's return are accumulating. The people writing that answer deserve to do so in a public forum that takes their findings seriously, rather than filters them through the symbolic needs of a conservation narrative that has not yet caught up with the ecological reality of its own success.